When a young woman abruptly stopped responding to calls and messages, her family immediately sensed that something was wrong. Authorities were contacted. And at first it appeared her disappearance would be resolved without much difficulty. Instead, the events that followed unfolded like a scripted crime thriller rather than reality. When the complete truth eventually emerged, it sent shock waves throughout the nation. Andrea Alber was born on April 17, 1991 in Flint, Michigan. During her childhood, she lost her mother and, after some time, her father remarried. The family later relocated to the small town of Otisville, where Andrea completed her high school education. Once she graduated, she began working at a nearby supermarket. Although she considered attending college, she was uncertain about what path to pursue. So, she continued working and saving money for her future. That was also where she met a coworker, a 19-year-old named Kenneth. Before long, the two began dating in November 2011 when Andrea was 20. Around that time, her aunt and uncle left town and asked her to watch their house. Since Andrea was still living with her parents, she chose to stay at her relatives' home until they returned. During the first few days, her boyfriend, Kenneth, and one of their friends visited. They spent time hanging out, watching movies, and enjoying themselves. Afterward, Andrea and Kenneth planned to spend the following day together. Andrea was supposed to pick him up on the evening of November 14th, but shortly beforehand, she texted him to say she wouldn't be able to come. Instead, she told him to come to her aunt and uncle's house and asked him to bring a few movie DVDs. Kenneth arrived around 7:30 p.m., but the house was dark, the doors were locked, and Andrea's car was gone. He knocked, but received no answer, then tried calling her, but she didn't respond. Assuming she had stepped out briefly, he decided to wait. About half an hour later, he finally received a text from her. Andrea said her plans had changed and assured him they would see each other the next day. She didn't say where she had gone, and none of Kenneth's follow-up messages were answered. The next day passed without any contact from Andrea. At first, Kenneth was the only one concerned since she was staying at her aunt and uncle's house. Andrea's father didn't think much of it at first, when he hadn't heard from her. But by the next day, when she also wasn't answering his calls, he began to worry. He asked another relative to check on the house, and she went there with Kenneth. They walked around and looked through the windows, but the place was empty. Her father then contacted Andrea's friends, and none of them had heard from her for over 24 hours. That was when the family started to fear that something terrible had happened, and they decided to begin searching. Andrea's relatives and friends divided into groups and drove through nearby towns, parks, and any other places she might have visited. By that evening, one of her friends found her car. It was parked in a secluded spot near a national park just a few miles from her relative's home. The doors were unlocked, and the keys were gone, but there was no sign of Andrea. Her father immediately contacted the police, who then reached out to Andrea's uncle and with his permission forced entry into the house. When officers went down to the basement, they encountered a horrifying scene. Andrea was seated in a chair with a gunshot wound to her head. Her body was taken to the medical examiner, who concluded she had been killed by a single gunshot fired from several feet away. Investigators determined that Andrea had been murdered 2 days before she was discovered. On the same night, she had planned to spend time with Kenneth, but abruptly Kenneth. The examination also revealed marks on her wrists, indicating they had been bound with plastic zip ties. By the time police discovered her, the restraints were no longer there. Even more unsettling, the analysis indicated they had been removed about 6 or 7 hours after her death, suggesting the killer either returned later or remained in the house for much of the night. Investigators also found that several items were missing, though the scene did not resemble a typical burglary. Most valuables were left untouched. Instead, the killer had taken items such as a bottle of perfume, a sweater, a camera, 3 knives, a rifle, some ammunition, and a small amount of cash. At the same time, jewelry, and even a small piece of solid gold that was openly visible were left behind. As crime scene technicians processed the house, detectives learned Andrea had a boyfriend and went directly to Kenneth's home. He told officers when he had last seen her and willingly provided a DNA sample and fingerprints. Police also took the clothes he had worn that night and searched his home, but nothing suspicious was found. Despite this, they brought Kenneth in for further questioning, and over time, detectives began to suspect he was responsible. Kenneth denied any involvement and even agreed to a polygraph test, which showed no signs of deception. He said that on the night of November 14, after Andrea abruptly canceled their plans, he was devastated. He believed the only reason she had done so was because she intended to break up with him. He went home, plugged in his phone, and texted a female friend, telling her Andrea was likely going to end the relationship. They exchanged messages for a while, after which Kenneth drove to the store where that friend worked. They continued discussing the situation, and eventually she told him that she and her roommate planned to watch a movie that night and invited him over. Kenneth arrived at their place around 10 p.m., a detail both women later confirmed. His phone records supported this, showing it connected to a nearby cell tower at that time. About 20 minutes earlier, he was also captured on surveillance footage at a gas station located between the store and the girl's house. That same night, police discovered that $300 had been withdrawn from Andrea's bank card. The withdrawal took place in a town called Davidson, roughly a 30-minute drive from her uncle's house. However, the timing raised questions. The transaction occurred just 7 minutes after Kenneth arrived at his friend's home. There was no possible way he could have been in both places at once. Yet, detectives were still unwilling to remove him from the list of suspects. Kenneth stayed with his friends until around midnight and then went home. The following morning, he tried calling Andrea several times, but she didn't answer. Worried, he drove to her relative's house around 10 a.m. and knocked on the door, but there was still no sign of her. He then left and was back home by about 11 a.m., a timeline confirmed by both his family and his phone's location data. Almost at the same time, another $300 was withdrawn from Andrea's account, this time in a different town even farther away. Police also obtained surveillance footage of the person using her card. While the image quality was too poor to identify a face, one particular detail stood out. The suspect had arrived in a white pickup truck. Yet, despite evidence suggesting otherwise, police weren't ready to clear Kenneth. They believed there were inconsistencies in his story. First, he admitted that he drove to Andrea's relative's house around the time she was killed and sat in his car outside for about half an hour, which struck detectives as suspicious. Second, when Andrea's friends and family organized a search for her on the evening of November 15, Kenneth said he wouldn't join because he had to work early the next morning. Later, he told detectives that he had already spent the entire day trying to find her, repeatedly calling her, and assumed she was just ignoring him. In Kenneth's mind, he believed Andrea had probably decided to break up with him. Not that anything terrible had happened. Another warning sign emerged when one of Kenneth's friends, who had been helping search for Andrea, asked him for the address of her relative's house. For some reason, Kenneth gave the wrong location about 3 miles away from the actual one. Investigators found this odd, since Kenneth was very familiar with the house. While none of this was definitive proof of guilt, detectives intensified their questioning. After more than 10 hours of interrogation, police announced that Kenneth had finally confessed. In his written confession, he claimed that he went over to Andreas that night and entered the house. When he went down to the basement, he said he saw her body on the floor and assumed she had killed herself. According to Kenneth, that's when he decided to stage the scene to make it look like a murder so her family wouldn't learn the truth. He admitted to taking a few items that were nearby, but gave little other detail. The confession was short, vague, and filled with ambiguous language. Kenneth maintained that he hadn't killed Andrea, only that he had found her body. Yet, authorities believed they finally had enough evidence and arrested him. As soon as police informed him he was being charged with murder, Kenneth immediately tried to retract his statement. He claimed detectives had pressured him for hours, bombarding him with accusations until he was completely exhausted. They finally told him that if he wrote down a version of events in which he found Andrea's body, he could go home. Kenneth said he trusted them, but instead his so-called confession became the central piece of evidence against him. He also claimed that detectives repeatedly misled him. They told him they had strong forensic evidence linking him to the crime and that he had failed the polygraph badly. But the most startling detail emerged later. Kenneth's grandfather had hired a lawyer and sent him to the station to help Yet, when the attorney tried to find out where Kenneth was being held, a detective simply hung up and warned colleagues not to disclose Kenneth's location to anyone. The lawyer spent the whole day calling every officer he could reach, but no one provided any answers. Meanwhile, Kenneth had no idea that the lawyer was even trying to contact him, and continued speaking to detectives alone. Kenneth claimed that his so-called confession was nothing more than him repeating what detectives had told him to say, just to be allowed to go home. In reality, Kenneth claimed he had no idea Andrea was even dead. Less than 24 hours after her body was discovered, detectives announced they had caught the killer. Kenneth's friends and family refused to believe he was involved, but at that point, there was little they could do. Meanwhile, police effectively shut down the investigation, confident that Kenneth's confession would be enough for a conviction. Forensics, however, told a very different story. Lab experts tested dozens of samples collected from the house, including skin found under Andrea's fingernails. The DNA belonged to an unknown male and was definitively not a match to Kenneth. Later, another sample from Andrea's car matched that same unidentified man. And then there was the issue with Andrea's bank card. Someone had been withdrawing money from her account, but it was clearly not Kenneth. Police still had no idea who the mysterious man could be. Despite these obvious red flags, just days after Kenneth's arrest, detectives claimed they had new evidence. One officer opened the sealed bag containing Kenneth's clothes from the night Andrea disappeared and found a single bloody hair stuck to his pants. Tests showed that both the hair and blood belonged to Andrea, but this alleged smoking gun had a major flaw. The pants themselves showed no trace of blood, not even under a microscope. The forensic specialist who examined them concluded that the hair must have landed there hours after Andrea's death, because Kenneth had been wearing those pants at the time of the murder. Blood spatter would have been unavoidable. Kenneth's lawyer argued that the hair was likely contamination. Police had seized Kenneth's clothes only about 30 minutes after Andrea's body was found, so it was entirely possible that an officer still carrying trace evidence from the crime scene accidentally transferred the hair onto the pants while packing them. The lawyer also pushed to have the confession thrown out, claiming police had deliberately prevented him from seeing his client during questioning. Adding to this, portions of the interrogation video had mysteriously gone missing, specifically the parts where, according to Kenneth, detectives were practically feeding him the right answers. The legal battle dragged on for 4 years until the court finally sided with the prosecution and allowed the confession to stand. During that time, Kenneth remained out on bail. But he was far from free. He had to wear a GPS ankle monitor and wasn't allowed to leave his house without police permission. The trial began in 2015, and the prosecution relied on just 2 main pieces of evidence: Kenneth's confession and the bloody hair found on his pants. Their theory claimed the murder occurred during a robbery, even though none of the stolen items were ever found in Kenneth's possession and Andrea's bank. Card had clearly been used by someone else. The prosecutor tried to resolve this contradiction by suggesting the robbery was staged. In other words, he argued that Kenneth killed Andrea to steal money and valuables and then faked the robbery. This argument was weak, especially since Kenneth's family was wealthy and he had no financial desperation. The prosecution also highlighted another detail. There were no signs of forced entry at the house. And Kenneth had a spare key. Andrea had given it to him just a few days before her death so he could visit whenever he wanted. Kenneth maintained that he had left the key on a table in the house 2 days before she died. His friend, who had been with him that day, confirmed his story, and police eventually found the spare key exactly where he said it would be. The defense, meanwhile, pointed to numerous inconsistencies in the case and instances of sloppy police work. They also emphasized something investigators seemed to overlook. Andrea's car had been taken and later abandoned a few miles from the house. Her father testified that the car had a specific issue. Oil constantly leaked onto the floor beneath the driver's seat, meaning Andrea's shoes were always stained. By that logic, anyone who drove the car would have gotten oil on their shoes. Yet, when experts examined Kenneth's boots, there was no trace of it. The prosecutor responded with a new theory. Kenneth must have had an accomplice. In this scenario, Kenneth allegedly killed Andrea while the accomplice took the stolen items, drove her car, and used her bank card. But another major problem undermined the prosecutor's case. The murder weapon was never found. Investigators determined that the missing rifle from Andrea's uncle's house didn't match the bullet that killed her, nor did any of Kenneth's parents' guns. Finally, Kenneth's lawyer accused police of completely ignoring other viable suspects. From the very start, they had tunnel vision on Kenneth and never seriously investigated anyone else to prove the point. The defense presented a list of 5 possible suspects with a man named Jeffrey, a mutual acquaintance of both Kenneth and Andrea. At the top, several red flags surrounded Jeffrey. First, he was the one who happened to find Andrea's car in the early hours of the search, even though it was parked miles from her house in a fairly secluded area. Second, that same day, he called Kenneth to ask about Andrea's whereabouts, even though Kenneth had never given him his number. Investigators later discovered that Andrea had scribbled Jeffrey's number on a piece of paper and left it on a nightstand right next to where an unidentified DNA sample was later found. Additionally, Jeffrey owned a car that closely resembled the one captured on surveillance footage at a gas station. When someone used Andrea's bank card, Andrea's brother also pointed investigators toward another potential suspect. He admitted that he was struggling with drug issues at the time and owed money to a local dealer. According to him, the dealer somehow knew Andrea had been saving a significant amount of cash from her job, which led her brother to believe the dealer might have killed Andrea to collect the money he was owed. There was also a young man named David, who came to the police's attention after his Father tipped them off, suggesting his son could be involved in Andrea's murder. David already had a criminal record for car thefts and assaults and even resembled the man seen withdrawing money from Andrea's bank card. Despite all this, detectives claimed they had investigated these leads, but could not find any concrete evidence linking them to the crime. When the trial concluded, the jury deliberated for 2 full days before reaching a verdict. Ultimately, they found Kenneth guilty of first-degree murder and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His lawyer immediately filed an appeal. Initially, the defense sought to overturn the conviction, arguing that Kenneth's confession had been coerced and that police had illegally denied him access to a lawyer. The court rejected that motion. Next, the defense challenged the robbery charge, noting that Kenneth was also convicted of theft, even though none of the stolen items were ever recovered. That appeal failed as well. But the third attempt succeeded. Kenneth's lawyer discovered a significant error in the jury paperwork. Jurors had been given 2 separate murder charges, first-degree and second-degree, to consider. For the first-degree charge, jurors had both options: guilty or not guilty. But for second-degree, only one option, guilty, was listed. In other words, the jury had no way to find Kenneth not guilty of second-degree murder. Their only choice was to determine how guilty he was. The appeals court couldn't overlook such a major error. In 2018, Kenneth was granted a new trial. By that time, he had already spent 3 years in prison. Following the ruling, he was released on bail again. Since then, Kenneth and his lawyer have continued pushing for new evidence that could identify the real killer, repeatedly urging police to retest the existing DNA samples. And in 2022, authorities finally agreed to conduct a fresh review. By then, Kenneth's new trial still hadn't started, and he remained out on bail. Forensic experts re-examined every unidentified male DNA sample linked to the case, but once again, nothing matched the FBI's database. They then turned their attention to the strongest piece of evidence, a cigarette, but found outside the house. That sample matched the same man whose skin cells had been found under Andrea's fingernails, confirming without a doubt that he was the real killer. Investigators sent the cigarette, but to a company specializing in forensic genetic genealogy. In January 2023, experts reported a breakthrough. By searching public genetic databases and tracing family connections, they identified a likely suspect, a 42-year-old man named Chadwick Mosley. Someone who had never appeared in the original case files. Detectives discovered that at the time of Andrea's murder, Chadwick had been living just 40 minutes away in a neighboring town. They reviewed his phone records from November 2011 and found that on the day Andrea was killed, his phone pinged a tower near her aunt and uncle's house 23 times. By 2023, Chadwick was living in Utah, working as a delivery driver and often staying in his van. Investigators asked local police to secretly obtain something with his DNA. But there was a challenge. Chadwick usually parked in open areas, making it nearly impossible to tail him without being noticed. Officers monitored him for 2 months, but never recovered a single item that could provide a DNA sample. Ultimately, detectives decided to confront him directly. Armed with a warrant, police approached Chadwick and collected his DNA sample. During the encounter, he denied any involvement in Andrea's death. But shortly afterward, lab results confirmed his DNA was found under Andrea's fingernails, inside her car, and in multiple locations around the house. As if that weren't enough, a search of his van uncovered a revolver, which ballistic tests confirmed was the weapon used to kill Andrea. 2 days after that initial encounter, police returned to arrest Chadwick, but he had already fled, apparently driving off in an unknown direction immediately after speaking with them. 3 weeks later, he was located in Montana near the Canadian border, where officers finally apprehended him. However, the ordeal didn't end there. While being transported to the airport for extradition to Michigan, Chadwick managed to escape from the police van. He somehow managed to free himself from both handcuffs and leg irons, vanishing once again. A few days later, a local sheriff accidentally spotted him paddling down a river in a canoe. That sighting led to his second capture, and this time, authorities successfully transported him to Michigan, where he was held in custody, awaiting trial. Bail was immediately denied given that he had already escaped twice. Chadwick pleaded not guilty and prosecutors began building their case. For local law enforcement, it was a nightmare. They had spent over a decade insisting Kenneth was the killer, appending his life in the process. Now, DNA under Andrea's fingernails, and the actual murder weapon pointed directly to Chadwick. Investigators even looked into whether there was any connection between Kenneth and Chadwick. There was a slim chance they had worked together, but there wasn't. Kenneth and Chadwick had no connection, and Andrea didn't know Chadwick either. At the time of her murder, he was a 32-year-old living in a neighboring town with no link to her. Still, despite this overwhelming new evidence, Kenneth's conviction wasn't overturned. He remains at home under strict monitoring with an ankle bracelet. To make matters worse, prosecutors doubled down, announcing plans to pursue a second trial and maintain the theory that Kenneth and Chadwick committed the murder together. In the end, Chadwick's trial never occurred because in February 2025, he entered a no-contest plea, essentially telling the court he would not contest the charges. But he still didn't admit guilt. He told the judge that he had been extremely drunk the night Andrea was killed and had no memory of the events. Although he didn't deny his involvement during the same hearing, a troubling fact emerged. Some officers had actually considered Chadwick a suspect in the very early days of the investigation. For reasons no one could explain, he was never officially included in the case file. By that time, detectives were already focused on Kenneth. Despite the DNA mismatch and the missing murder weapon, Chadwick was ultimately sentenced to life without parole. He also addressed Andrea's family in court, apologizing for what he had done. For Kenneth, however, nothing changed. His attorney immediately demanded that the charges against Kenneth be dropped, but prosecutors refused. They argued that Chadwick's conviction didn't erase Kenneth's alleged role and vowed to proceed with a second trial. Chadwick himself maintained that he didn't know Kenneth or Andrea and had no accomplice. Yet, the state pressed on. That second trial is now scheduled for January 2026, while Kenneth remains under house arrest. Meanwhile, his defense team has enlisted a well-known forensic expert to review the bloody hair on Kenneth's pants, confirming what earlier reports suggested. It could only have ended up there hours after Andrea's death, not during the crime. Taken together with the DNA evidence, the murder weapon, Chadwick's conviction, and the forensic analysis, Kenneth now has a strong chance of finally clearing his name. But the damage is already done. 14 years of his life have essentially been lost. He spent years in prison and more years confined to his own home. Even if the courts ultimately recognize his innocence, that time can never be returned. And if he chooses to pursue justice against the officers and prosecutors responsible, it could take many more years with no guarantee he'll ever be fully made whole. If you found this case fascinating, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. We post crime case videos every night. Until next time, stay sharp, stay vigilant.